Okay, so it is my pleasure to introduce the next speaker, who you all know. I'll be using this aid because I seem to need glasses already. So Professor Bolette Pedersen is a professor of computational linguistics, deputy head of the Department of Nordic Studies and Linguistics, and the leader of the Center of Language Technology at the University of Copenhagen. Her main research interests include computational lexicography, lexical semantics, and linguistics ontologies, which happen to be my favorite subjects as well. She was coordinator of many projects at the European level, including the Nordic Network for Harmonization of Language Resources in the Nordic countries, the Danish sensible participation on sense tagging, the engine behind DANNet, the Danish WordNet, and many others. And her most recent work is involved with semantic annotation and processing, lexicography, and the linguistic ontologies and language technologies. And her latest project, I think, it's Central Word Register for Danish, which is actually a computational lexicon for AI. So I think this will be touched upon in her talk. I give you Professor Pedersen.
Well, thank you very much. And also thank you very much to you and to Svetla for actually inviting me for this event. I did some thinking, looking back, and it turns out it's 25 years ago since I was last in Bulgaria. And that was with the conference Recent Advances in NLP. And I was doing my PhD at that time. And I must say a lot of things has happened in our field, and I suppose also in Bulgaria since then. So 25 years. So it's about time I'm back again. I'm very happy to be here. So I'm going to talk about lexical conceptual resources, and I'm going to talk about what is their role now that we are doing a lot of statistical language models. And we've heard a lot of talks today using language models, and there's no doubt that language models, statistical models, is really the way forward. But also, I still believe that the lexical conceptual resources are very, very important to get into the models, to inform them by what we do with the lexical conceptual resources. And that's what I'm going to talk about here. So why? So I'll start out by saying something a little about what language models cannot do for NLP as they are right now, and why lexical conceptual resources are therefore still relevant if we want to do NLP that can actually understand to some extent what's going on in language. I also want to argue that to do good lexical conceptual resources, we should see them as part of an infrastructure. And I mean this in two ways, both as part of the national infrastructure for the language community in the particular country, but also internationally. And here, of course, I refer to a recent project that has been completed this summer, namely the Alexis project, which primarily had as an aim to ensure a good lexical infrastructure to facilitate that lexicography becomes an important part of NLP. And finally, I will talk about some of my own work with the Danish resources. So in many ways, as we've seen, neural language models have disrupted the field of NLP. So we now apply large pre-trained language models and fine-tune them to specific tasks. And we must also say that generally these models outperform previous models on these tasks. However, we should also be aware that language models are still not performing natural language understanding. It's a very superficial thing going on, looking purely on distribution of words and characters. And also, if we look at synthetic text produced by language models, They may look very impressive at first glance, but very quickly we get the feeling that there's no meaning in this. It's meaningless what is produced. So models based on pure text, they are biased to a great extent. They're biased not only towards the specific text on which they are based, but they're also biased towards the general nature of texts, what we do in text and what we do with texts. So texts do not necessarily contain the background knowledge which is necessary for the interpretation of the same text. And I think that's where the lexical conceptual resources come in. So there's this very popular, simple and illustrative example of the so-called black sheep problem. And I'm really fond of good examples. This is not my own one, so I can praise it. I think good examples really help us understand what's going on. So what is this example about? Well, if we ask a language model, what is the color of a sheep? The answer we will get out, for most languages at least, is that it's a black sheep. Whereas if we look into the lexical conceptual resources, the answer would be that it's white or gray. And I think this resembles very well what is going on in statistical models compared to what we have in the conceptual resources. In texts, and in particular the kind of text that we're collecting easily on the web, newswire, social media texts, we typically describe or highlight the extraordinary, the spectacular, the controversial, the forefront, the interesting things. And this will lead to many damaging biases, as has been pointed out in several papers recently by Bender et al. In 2021. So we have to be very careful with our curation of what we put into the models. So the black sheep here illustrates the foreground, and the white-gray sheep illustrates the background and what we describe in the lexical conceptual resources. So just I looked it up in our own WordNet to see, okay, is it true then? Do we actually describe the sheep as white? And yes, that was in the definition, mostly whitish, woolly fur. So maybe I like this example with the black sheep, but maybe it is not such a good example after all, because it's a metaphor. And of course, metaphors will always be tricky to deal with in NLP, and they will always sort of come to the front because they use the exact same pattern of distribution every time we see it. So it's no surprise that the black sheep will sort of come up very high in the statistical model. But I think it's still good because the metaphor in itself expresses what we mean when we say that it's the forefront. So exactly the black sheep of the family is the one that does not follow the prototypical path, but does something else. And that's what is given in this metaphor. So just a few other examples, which are not metaphors, but more like the concrete or the literal meaning going on. So in Denmark, the most typical roofs are A-formed. But if we ask our Danish language model, the answer is that the roofs are flat. Because that's what we talk about, because that's where we have the problems. Because of course we do have some houses with flat roofs, but typically the rain will come into those houses because it's difficult to make a good flat roof and so forth. And again, the lexical conceptual resource describes the background, the prototypical, what is the most normal to find. I have a few other examples. I think many of them have already been presented in literature. If I ask the Danish language model, what is the sex of a doctor or a priest? Curiously enough, the language model says it's female, because that's still an exception somehow. So when we talk about a doctor and a priest, we wouldn't normally talk about the sex unless it's a female. Then we would probably think it would be relevant to mention it. Whereas in the lexical conceptual resource, the definition is rather neutral, a person who takes this kind of job. So yeah, the lexical conceptual resources describe exactly the background, the prototypical. And together with this, of course, also a lot of other kinds of information, which I will go into in more detail. So it can be either the syntagmatic relational information, the paradigmatic information or the sentiment information that you could express in these resources. So why are lexical conceptual resources still relevant? Well, we have been compiling them for a long time, and they do contain a lot of information. And the aim we have had during all these years is to provide NLP systems with formally expressed information about the semantics of words and phrases, how they refer internally to the text, externally to the world, and the connotation that they evoke. So if we look into wordnets and ontologies, we could see basically they're describing the kind of vertical information, the paradigmatic information, whereas framenets, prop banks, and verb nets give the syntagmatic information, the relations between the different parts of the phrase. And finally, with the sentiment lexicons, we give the connotative information. Is it positive? Is it negative? That kind of information. So if we look into the paradigmatic descriptions of the wordnets, we typically describe the meaning via the words that can substitute it in a specific context. So that could correspond to the synonym, the hyponym, the hyponym, the meronym, the antonym of a particular word. And we can also, of course, add more relations. We see that the different wordnets in the world have a different set of relations. It's not the exact same set of relations. For instance, in the Danish wordnet, we added the qualia structure relations for Pustoyevsky's theory of qualia structure. So we have the telic relation, which we call the used for relation. What is this particular artifact used for? What color does it have? Where is it located? And so forth. Ontologies. Well, we sometimes call wordnets linguistic ontologies because they have quite a lot of resemblances with ontologies. Because ontologies provide some of the same kinds of information. Here we normally don't refer to a hyponymy relation, but to an is-a relation. And the two roughly correspond to the same kind of relation, but not completely. However, we mostly claim that ontologies are language independent in contrast to wordnets, which are always language specific. And they talk about classes and properties, attributes, and instances. And typically in ontologies, you would establish relations among these or between these instances, sometimes also among classes. Let me say just a few words about the instances, because normally we don't have instances in wordnets. We may, I think Princeton wordnet has some countries, but generally the proper nouns are left out of our linguistic ontologies. Whereas in the ontologies, they play a very central role. So the ontology can be said to capture actually also encyclopedic knowledge to an extent where the wordnet does not. However, in praxis, I see that there's quite a big gray zone between what is the encyclopedic knowledge, reference to the world and so forth, and what is linguistic knowledge. So there's a big gray zone overlapping between the wordnet and the ontology. If we move to the syntagmatic descriptions, which typically talk about what does what to whom, when, and where, then you could say it's kind of the horizontal relations, the relations among the phrases, the different complements in the phrase. So where's the agent, where's the patient, where's the goal, where's the location, where's the time, that kind of information. So how do the elements of a phrase relate semantically to each other? What are the semantic roles? And during the last decades, I think at least 3 different ways of approaching this has sort of become standards, actually, both framenets, prop banks, and verbnets. And in essence, they do some of the same work. The framenets are more detailed with respect to the particular semantic frames, whereas prop banks and verbnets tend to generalize a little more over these semantic roles. Yeah. And then finally, the resources I've mentioned so forth typically describe the denotative meaning, but many words also have a co-meaning, namely the connotative one. So whether it's positive, negative, or neutral. And we typically describe this in sentiment lexicons, which are becoming or have been very popular for opinion mining and sentiment analysis. Okay, so I'll now move on to the third part of my talk, talking about lexical conceptual resources, part of an infrastructure, because yeah, it's not so that everything is solved as long as you have a lexical conceptual resource. We have lots of problems with lexical semantic resources. I've mentioned here a few of them: scalability, coverage, maintenance, and bias. So it's not, I've talked about biases in neural language models, but lexical conceptual resources also contain biases. But these are at least human generated. I don't know if it makes it better, but I think to some extent it is better, because we know a little more what we're doing than the machines do. So just to give an example, we're right now running through the lexical material of Danish to repair the gender bias that we suddenly see in the definitions and the examples that we didn't see 3 years ago. So because society is changing, we suddenly see huge biases in the lexical descriptions that we want to remedy. So, and this will happen all the time because society is changing. And so what I want to say here is that we need to, in particular for the smaller languages, I mean, we are 5 million Danish speakers, and I think for Bulgarian, it's not diverging too much from this. It's very important that we don't waste our time and money on separate or fragmented NLP lexical resources that are never really put into use and never really maintained, because it's too expensive. It is expensive to develop lexical resources, and we should be very careful that this is not wasted, and that it is maintained and enlarged over time. And how can we ensure this? Well, I think we have to see it as a task of the language community as a whole in the country, and particularly in the smaller countries, because we need to take care of our languages. So what I'm going to talk about from now on is actually how to see the development of lexical conceptual resources for NLP as part of the general language initiatives of a country, and why it should be done in close connection what is been done by classical lexicographers in the lexicographical milieux. So one project that I'd like to mention, where I've actually worked together with Svetla, is the Alexis project, which addresses exactly the problems by arguing for better collaboration between the NLP milieux and the lexicographers. And this should be done through an improved infrastructure, through better tools and services. And this is, of course, talking at an international level. It's a European project, so it's much about opening up dictionaries in Europe to make them more useful in NLP, and to get better tools for maintenance and that kind of thing. Of course, this is at the international level, but it's, for us, for instance, in Denmark, it's been a great support to see this international initiative of people working together in the two communities and actually trying to bring lexicography forward into NLP, also in the era of the language models. Okay, so let me give some examples from my own work. I said in the beginning, oops, that it's 25 years since I did my PhD and had a talk here in Bulgaria. And I've actually worked in the field for all those 25 years. So what I'm showing here is not something we just did overnight. It's been a very, very long process, maybe not 25 years, but at least 20 years of collaboration between the traditional lexicographers of Denmark and the NLP groups in Denmark. So it started out actually with the Danish dictionary, the red one on the picture here, a classical medium-sized Danish dictionary, which came out in the beginning of the zeros. And we decided, I was not part of the development of that dictionary, but I got very interested in it because I saw that it was marked up in HTML, which at that time was very, very nice, and it gave some perspectives of reuse for NLP. So we used the Danish dictionary to semi-automatically produce the Danish wordnet from the definitions, because the genus proximum of the definitions in the Danish dictionary were kept in a specific field. So we could do this completely automatically as a kind of wizard, and then go through it, of course, manually to see whether it was correct. And I want to add another thing here about the infrastructure thing, because I think it's also very important that we take it seriously, that if we do NLP resources for our own languages, they should be monolingually defined. I'm not in favor of transferring from English and then building up from there. I think it's very dangerous in a way, because you get a lot of biases, and that's exactly what you don't want when you actually spend your time building up lexical resources. So in the Danish wordnet, we use what we call the merge approach. We build it up completely monolingually based on the Danish dictionary, and then we did the mapping to Princeton wordnet afterwards, which was not easy, because of course there was, in particular in the vocabulary, big differences in vocabulary, because in the Danish vocabulary we have other ways of describing schools, law, all kinds of things of society. Simply, there's another vocabulary, it's another taxonomy that you can make. Food is another example. Food taxonomies are very different from country to country. So cheese will play a different role in Denmark in a food taxonomy for Danish than in a food taxonomy for Italian, for instance, because we eat cheeses in other contexts and do it in another way and have other kinds of cheese and so forth. So just to argue, if we spend the time to do these resources for our own language, do them monolingually. That would be my advice, because otherwise we will be having to overcome the biases that have been born into the project, so to speak. I'm not against language transfer. I mean, we use it, we do a lot of language transfer, but not when actually handcrafting the lexical conceptual resources, because those are the only real evidence of a particular language society and the culture of that society. So if we take it seriously that we want language technology for our own languages, I think we should really go the whole way here. So yeah, that was just one of my special things. Okay, so the Danish dictionary, we then made the Danish wordnet. From the Danish wordnet, they made the Danish thesaurus. So with the wordnet they had, because we strengthened up the taxonomy a lot from what we had from the genus proximum. And they were very happy about that among the lexicographers, because they could actually make a Danish thesaurus, a paper dictionary, taking the wordnet as the part of departure, and then of course doing a lot of extra work, adding more thematic groupings and so forth. But anyway, it helped them start from a higher level than they could have done if they had not had the wordnet. And then from the thesaurus, we built the Danish FrameNet lexicon. The corpus is very small, but the lexicon is, I think we have around 9,000 verbs described and deverbal nouns for Danish. And again, we could take advantage of both the wordnet and the Danish thesaurus, because the synonyms and near synonyms would be grouped together. So the annotation of the particular semantic frames would go rather fast and be rather consistent in that way. So with a quite small grant, we succeeded in producing this lexicon. What we're still lacking is the annotated corpus. It's quite small what we have, so there's still some work to do there. The Danish sentiment lexicon is the most recent resource that we completed. It was presented at the LREC conference. And again, the Danish thesaurus, the wordnet, helped us assign polarity to the words in a rather quick and to some extent also more consistent way than if you were just do it in the wild, so to speak. And a very important thing about all these resources is that they share the same sense ID numbers. So it's the same sense inventory for Danish that we use for all the resources. Now you may think, how can that work? Because most classical dictionaries are very fine-grained. And this is also the case for the Danish dictionary. So it's not that we keep all the senses. I mean, we can collapse them, but we still refer back to the same core inventory of the Danish dictionary. And we've been doing that for all 20 years. And it means that we have a very strong connection of resources here. So when we update one of them, the rest will sort of come along in the same round. Okay, how much time do I have? Okay, I'll move to the last part, and that's the last initiative that we're doing. It's called the Central Word Register for Danish. And in this project, we actually also go together with the Danish Language Council. So it's now two language institutions, the Danish Language Council and the Danish Society for Language and Literature, which are the ones that did the Danish Dictionary and the Danish Thesaurus. And then finally, my own group, the Center for Language Technology. And this project is financed by the Danish Agency for Digitalization as part of the AI strategy for Denmark. So the aim is to provide the Danish digital society with a large, high quality lexical resource for NLP and AI. And we thought, well, we already have a lot of bits and parts for this. So the idea is, okay, I don't think it's the last version of my slides, but never mind. I'll move on. Yeah, well, anyway, the idea was to use as much as possible that we already had, but to simplify it, both with respect to sense inventory, so to collapse, merge senses so that we would have an overcomable sense inventory for NLP and for AI, and also to reduce a little bit the semantic information into something, some of the more core elements of semantic information. So just a few words about how did we actually collapse the senses. We also presented this work at LREC this year. We first elaborated a number of lexicographical principles, and then we hand annotated a lot of the material. So we looked through a lot of the entries and collapsed them by hand, following these principles. And one of the questions we asked ourselves is, how well do the Danish language models that we're using both a word-to-vec and a BERT model, how well do they correlate with the human judgments of senses, and which types of senses are distributionally confirmed in our language models? Because, I mean, it's obvious we don't want to have a lot of senses that we can never distinguish. I mean, the sense tagger will never be able to distinguish them anyway. So, and these two illustrations show a very clear distributional pattern of a word with 4 senses, and a more subtle, more confused visualization of the distribution of some of the other senses. And they can be even worse. I mean, for some of the polysemous words, it's a complete mixture. And the very polysemous words, we simply did them all by hand because we couldn't leave it to the automatic methods to do it. So the gold standard consisted of 3,500 highly polysemous lemmas and 2,700 average polysemous lemmas. And we actually achieved high annotated agreement among the lexicographers, and we reduced the sense inventory with 43%. And we're doing part of it semi-automatically based on word-to-vec and BERT. So summing up, lexical conceptual resources, they're important resources for defining the background knowledge implicit for language understanding. And they describe the meaning of the vocabulary and how it refers to the world in different ways, from different perspectives. And I believe they can fruitfully inform language models. But of course, we need to be careful when establishing them. It's expensive to make them. We need to make sure that they're scalable, maintainable, and of high quality. And therefore, we should see them as part of a language community's investment in language resources. So I think that was my last words. And here are some references to the work that I've been referring to today. It's really group work, all of which we've been doing. So thank you very much.